Hi, everyone. My name is Becca. I'm one of the nurse practitioners at MD Anderson. I worked in the outpatient setting for some time before transitioning to research. And today I have the privilege to present to you all on clinical trials. So clinical trial is a research study used to determine if a drug is safe and effective for patient use. There's 4 phases of clinical trials. I'm sure you've heard of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4 studies, and I'll cover those shortly and let you know what those mean. Oh, not yet. Yeah. So there's a big misconception about what clinical trials are, and that clinical trials are meant for patients with no other treatment options left. And that's simply not true. Clinical trials are available to advance our standard of care at every phase, and they're available for patients who've undergone 30 lines of therapy or no lines of therapy at all. Next slide, please. So phase 1 studies look to establish the safety and efficacy of establish the dose and safety of the drug. These are smaller studies that enroll smaller amount of participants, usually about 15 to 30. And these trials introduce the drug to humans for the first time. The investigators look for the maximum tolerated dose. Phase 2 studies are a little bit bigger. They enroll more patients, and they're looking to establish the safety and efficacy of the drug. These trials enroll less than 100, but still more than the phase 1s. Phase 3 studies compare the drug to the investigational product to the standard of care option. So standard of care drugs are things that have been FDA approved. Usually in this phase, the patients are randomized, so either to the standard of care arm or the investigational arm. And these studies enroll a lot more patients, so greater than 100. And phase 4 studies, they're looking at the drug in the post-marketing area, and they're just really looking at long-term use. This is once the drug has been FDA approved. Next slide, please. Okay, so the research team is comprised of many members. The principal investigator is the person who brings the study to the team and introduces it. They oversee the conduct of the study to make sure that things are running along as they should. The study coordinator is the research nurse or the research nurse practitioner, and they are looking at the implementation of the study. They make sure that we are doing whatever the protocol tells us to do, ensuring that the team is acting accordingly, as well as the patients. The data coordinators are responsible for data integrity. So what that means is they compile all the data from the research notes, the clinic notes, and they put together information on the safety and the response data for the investigator and the sponsors to review. And the sponsor is the pharmaceutical company, and they're responsible for providing the protocol and also providing the funding for the protocol. Then we have auxiliary support, and that's our regulatory team. Our regulatory team is in charge of managing the regulatory files to ensure that they're meeting the guidelines of the Institutional Review Board. And the Institutional Review Board is our IRB, and they're the administrative body that protects the welfare of the patients and ensures that we are acting ethically. So every site will have a research lab of some sort. At MD Anderson, our research lab is called this CTRC, or the Clinical Translational Research Center. And what they do is they administer early phase investigational trials, and they'll manage our samples. And finally, we have the investigational pharmacy. They're in charge of preparing and storing our investigational products. Next slide, please. So the enrollment process is a little bit extensive, but what happens at our site is a patient is first identified by the clinic team. And so, the patient might either have an interest in the trial, or the clinic team might determine this patient might be eligible for, a specific trial they have in mind. And so a screening request is sent to the research team to kind of look at the patient's chart and see if what trials they may preliminarily meet eligibility for. At that time, we'll compile a list for the clinic team to review, and the physician will discuss with the patient which protocol would be best. Once a decision has been made, then the research team will be notified, and the research nurse or research nurse practitioner will contact the patient and give a brief overview of the trial and obtain permission for financial clearance. Financial clearance usually takes about a week or 2, but we really have to have that part done before we can move on to consenting, screening, then enrollment. Next slide, please. So this is just a kind of a diagram to show you the trial progression. So we have study identification, financial clearance, consent, screening, enrollment. Then we have the trial start, which is cycle 1, day 1. The length of the trial really varies according to the protocol. Usually in the relapse refractory setting, patient, the trials would go on until progression. But in some cases, the sponsor will set a end time. So, after completion of 18 cycles or 20 cycles, then we'll have end of treatment. At end of treatment, that's when we stop giving the investigational product. And then a lot of protocols will have a safety follow-up visit that usually occurs after like about 30 days after the last dose of the drug is given. So the safety follow-up visit is important because it allows the provider to kind of evaluate the patient, make sure that there are no other toxicities the patient might have that are attributable to the investigational product. And so that part, that is the time when we would make that determination. And after that, we would move the patient into long-term follow-up or survival visits. Now, the long-term follow-up visits usually vary depending on, what the protocol says. Some long-term follow-up visits are every 3 months, some are every 6, or some are annual. It just really depends. Now, the length of the clinical trial will also vary depending not only on what it says in the protocol, but also based on patients' willingness to continue to participate. It'll vary, based on if the sponsor or the investigator or even the FDA wants to hold or halt, enrollment. So those are other other factors that might affect the trial length. Next slide, please. Okay, true or false? While on clinical trial, the trial will cover all costs. Anybody? False, exactly. Next slide, please. This is absolutely false. And this is another big misconception a lot of patients have, that when you come on clinical trial, everything is paid for, and that's not true. So we have our standard of care costs and our research costs. So standard of care costs are things that we typically have done regardless if you're on trial or not. So, when you go to see your doctor, he or she usually orders blood work. That's routine care that's already set forth by NCCN guidelines or whatever. And the treatment they prescribe you in the standard of care setting would be treatments that have already been FDA approved. These are costs that are either billed to the insurance or billed to the patient, depending upon how the patient's insurance is set up or if they don't have it. Research costs would be things that are not standard of care. So things that are research related, for instance, research samples like pharmacokinetics, extra bone marrow biopsy testing, extra procedures, things like that, that we would not routinely do for our patients. Those are billed usually to the sponsor. So our investigational products, those are not FDA approved. The sponsors will usually cover those. So some studies will offer patient reimbursement, and this is determined and discussed upfront during the consent process. The amount will vary depending on, from sponsor to sponsor, but these will cover things like travel, food, parking, lodgings, things like that. So next slide, please. Okay, so how are sites allotted slots? So some protocols don't require slot allotment, which is great. So it's open enrollment. If you have interest and you're eligible, great, we can get you on, right? But a lot of times slot allotment is set by the rules that the sponsor comes up with. So we have to adhere to that. So in a lot of cases, slot allotment might be competitive. And what that looks like, and the reason for that is because, especially if you have a study that is that a lot of sites are involved in, then they have to have an equitable way of distributing these slots, right? And sometimes these sites are from all around the world. Like we have investigator calls with sites from Japan, so it's always interesting. But the other thing is the slot allotment process can vary across protocols and may rotate to different sites. So for instance, the sponsor may say, okay, MD Anderson, you can have the first slot. And so if we're unable to produce a patient for that slot will move on to the next site, and so on and so forth. If a patient is not able to get a slot right away, they may be put on a wait list. But wait lists are not always first come, first serve. It's usually determined by the sponsor how they want to do that. And sometimes they'll say, okay, well, we want to, this is our wait list, and we're going to pick the patient that looks the fittest, that has, the best, performance status, that has, well-controlled myeloma. Or some other sponsors might say, well, we want the patient who can dose the soonest, like who is able to meet their washout the soonest and, who can start tomorrow, right, basically. So, and in some cases, if a patient fills a slot, but they're not able to meet the eligibility, then that slot will be released again to the sites to kind of try and fill it. So my job is to make sure that the patients I have who want to be considered for clinical trial are as ready to go as soon as possible. So I try to make this patient's application look the most attractive to the sponsor. And that might mean submitting for financial clearance early, because as I mentioned before, that takes about 1 to 2 weeks. And if we have that out of the way and a slot becomes available, I can tell the sponsor, like, look, I have a patient who's already met financial clearance. They're very fit. Their myeloma is under good control. This would be an excellent candidate for this clinical trial. Next slide, please. Okay, so the consent is a document that outlines the study and that the patient has to sign to give permission to participate. And the consent will it'll talk about the drug, it'll talk about risks, it'll talk about costs and compensations, and the patient's rights, as well as contacts. So contacts as in who's the principal investigator, what their number is, who's the sponsor, what number can you reach the institutional review board at. This must be done prior to any protocol-related procedures. So a lot of times I'll tell my patients, please make sure you come and see me first and sign the consent before you do any study-related procedures like vital signs, labs. And the reason is because if an auditor comes and sees that a patient has gotten labs first before they were consented, they'll say, you basically drew blood on a patient who did not give you permission to do so. And that, is a big no-no. So that's why we consent first. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next part is screening. So screening is a protocol-defined testing and evaluation period that must occur prior to enrollment on the study. And so the research coordinator will review the results of the screening to determine if the patient meets eligibility. Usually these screening tests involve diagnostic lab tests, research lab tests, procedures like bone marrow biopsies, echo, EKG, PFTs, imaging like PET scans, bone surveys, things like that. They must occur within a protocol specified window, and that's usually 21 to 28 days. And during that period, the washouts must be met. So washout means time off the last line of therapy the patient was on. Sometimes it's 2 weeks, sometimes it's 4 weeks, sometimes it's 3 months. It just really depends on what the protocol says. Next slide, please. So in order to successfully enroll onto the study, the patient must meet all eligibility criteria. And this is really to ensure that the right patient is coming on study. We want to make sure that patients participating are safe to do so. And really, because if the wrong patient enrolls, then it's a safety risk to that patient. But not only that, it can hinder our ability to enroll other patients moving forward. So we really want to make sure that, all the screening tests are done, the patient's chart is vetted and, reviewed appropriately. The patient should be in relatively good condition. That means no out of control infections. We don't want a patient with COVID, enrolling on an investigational product, right? We don't want, and we want toxicities, to manage to a certain degree. So we don't want a patient with like crippling neuropathy getting this investigational drug. Next slide, please. After eligibility is verified, then we send the appropriate documentation to the principal investigator and to the sponsors to review and give us approval to start treatment. And after that, the research coordinator will arrange for, the treatment plan to start. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of expectations and responsibilities that patients must have when they come on study. And the biggest one is protocol compliance. The protocol is written to protect the patient, right? So we want to ensure that the conduct of the study is being followed. So one of the things that we have to be mindful of is treatment windows. We understand that patients have lives. Like if their treatment date is supposed to be on Monday, they may not be able to give every Monday like forever, right? Like kids graduate, there's family obligations or whatnot. So treatment windows are written into the protocol to allow the patient a little bit of leeway of when they can receive their treatment. So if they're due for treatment on Monday, maybe they can get it on like 2 days before or 2 days after that date, maybe a Saturday, maybe a Wednesday. So the research team will really work with the patient on that. The other important thing is reporting toxicities. So we want to make sure we understand the safety profile of this investigational product that we are giving. And so if patient says, hey, I have diarrhea, we want to know, well, when did it start? When did it end? What kind of drugs did you take to mitigate those symptoms? What was the quality of the diarrhea? Things like that. And sometimes, the patients will write toxicity logs to detail their side effects. The third thing is drug accountability. So if we are giving a oral chemotherapy drug, the patients will have to fill out this pill diary and submit it after the end of every cycle. And the pill diary will just say, okay, this is when you need to take your drug. Did you take it? Yes or no? If it's no, then tell us why. After the patient has filled it out, signed it, they would need to submit it to the research coordinator at the end of the cycle. Another thing along with drug accountability is ensuring that any missed doses of oral regimens are given, are returned to the team. So if you missed an oral chemo pill, make sure you reconcile it on your pill diary and return them at the end of the month along with your empty pill bottles. Because the last thing you want is for patients to flush those pills down the toilet and contaminate our blood supply, right? Or our water supply. And finally, patients may be required to submit protocol required logs. So these would be like temperature logs, questionnaires, things like that. Usually the coordinator will, make sure the patient is aware of what to turn in and what not to. Big thing is communication. So we want to make sure that the team is informed. One of my fears is that a patient is admitted to an outside facility. I wouldn't know that unless the patient tells me, right? And so once the patient informs me of that, I'm able to take the appropriate steps to make sure that, their treatments are communicated with the team that is looking after them. Again, if patients want to be reimbursed, they have to keep receipts. At MD Anderson, we advise for patients not to staple receipts to papers because then the team has to pull them apart and it becomes very cumbersome. So, keep them loose. And just following all protocol requirements is really important. Next slide, please. Other expectations patients should have is, when on trial, there's going to be more testing. So instead of, just going to diagnostic labs, you're going to have to go to the research labs for pharmacokinetic testing or maybe extra bone marrow procedures. Patients should have the expectations that, there may be more frequent follow-ups. So for instance, long-term follow-ups will occur even after the trial is over, right? I have a study that has long-term follow-ups up to 15 years. So just to be mindful of that. And also another big question I always get is, how is the study doing? What are the results of the study? Well, we don't know, and the results are proprietary. They cannot be shared unless the sponsor releases them to be shared, and sometimes that takes a lot of time before they will actually do so. Yeah, next slide. So why clinical trials? We know that patients who enroll on clinical studies do better than patients who don't, and in patients who've enrolled in frontline studies, we see that the median overall survival is greater in those who've enrolled and those who didn't. And we see that with overall survival 103 months versus 63 months, which is, stark. Clinical trials allow patients the opportunity to try new treatments. It helps providers establish new standards of care. It is necessary for the advancement of cancer therapy, developing new treatment strategy like treatment sequencing and finding new regimens. And for patients and providers alike, it provides a hope for therapeutic benefit, especially in cancers that aren't curable, like myeloma. Next slide. So should you participate in clinical trials? Well, with anything, with benefit, there's always a risk, right? And, one of the risks is time commitment. Clinical trials take up a lot of time. And, if you live in New York, are you going to want to travel to MD Anderson for a clinical trial, right? That's a big question that patients have to ask. Another fear is the fear of treatment toxicities, especially in our early phase studies. We don't know the entire safety profile of the drug. We might know some of it, but we don't know all of it. So that's another fear that patients might have. And then there's the fear of randomization. Patients enroll on study to try the investigational product, but if they're going to be randomized to the standard of care arm, their fear is, well, why should I, participate if I'm just going to be doing the standard of care? Then there's the risk of financial uncertainty. And it's not just like, there's rising medical care costs. I mean, we're all aware of that, but it's also the time spent being away from work and having to commit to, treatment. We all know that myeloma therapy is very time consuming, right? And then finally, there might be a fear of exclusion to future studies. So for instance, some of our protocols will target the same target like BCMA, BiTEs, and BCMA targeting CAR T cell therapies. So oftentimes, if you participate in one, it'll exclude you from the other. So things like that. Yeah. Next slide, please. So how do you know if you're eligible for a clinical trial? Well, the first thing you should do is discuss this with your clinic team. Know what trials are available to you. There's a website, clinicaltrials.gov. If you go on, it'll give all the available clinical trials there are and kind of give you a brief overview of what they are. If you want more information on a specific trial, you can let your team know, and usually I'll provide the patient the consent form, which will give a lot of details about, what it is. Attend conferences. It's very important that patients are active engagers in their healthcare and keep good record. Know what your history is. Know what lines of therapy you've been on, because that ultimately helps you become a better advocate for your own healthcare. And know what your treatment options are. Next slide. And that's it. Thank you.